On September 10, 1939, the British submarine HMS Oxley was sunk off the coast of Norway for a loss of all but 2 of her crew. The war was barely a week old, and the Royal Navy had already lost its first submarine in what would become a long conflict. More shocking, however, were the circumstances of the loss of the Oxley, shrouded in wartime secrecy and propaganda. The sinking of HMS Oxley, the first Allied submarine to be sunk in the Second World War, deserves to be remembered.
The O class of British submarines were the result of a 1925 recognition of the need for an overseas class of submarine. Although developed from the previous L class, the O class recognized a need for greater range for patrol in the Pacific. The prototype was HMS Oberon, approved by the Navy Board in August 1926 and commissioned in August 1927. 270 foot long and 28 foot at the beam, Oberon had initially been called the O1, but was named HMS Oberon during construction. The submarines of the class would be the first of the Royal Navy to be given names rather than the previous convention of only referring to submarines by numbers. All names of boats of the class, of course, starting with O. With a range of 8,400 nautical miles, the new class had nearly double the range of the preceding L class. The class was also the first to be equipped with the game-changing Aztec sonar system. Oberon would be followed with 2 boats of a subclass. The online navalencyclopedia.com explains that the Royal Australian Navy had a small but potent surface fleet, but lacked submersibles as a deterrent. The strategic situation in the Pacific had changed with the demise of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1924. The Royal Australian Navy believed that they needed a deterrent to possible Japanese expansion, and so had agreed with the Royal Navy that the second pair of boats of the O class would go to them. In fact, the need was seen as critical and the construction rushed, so that HMS Oxley, named after Australian explorer Lieutenant John Oxley, was commissioned in April 1927, months ahead of HMS Oberon. The 2 boats of the Oxley subclass, Oxley and Otway, were 8 foot 6 inches shorter than the Phase II O-class vessels that followed, and were aesthetically slightly different than their Royal Navy cousins. HMAS Oxley and Otway proved their endurance when in February 1928 they set out for Australia. Naval historian John Bastock noted in his 1975 book Australia's Ships of War that this was, at the time, the longest ever unescorted voyage ever undertaken by a British submarine. The 2 made a grand entrance into Sydney Harbour on February 14, 1929. But the 2 boats would not be in the Royal Australian Navy for long. Australia had been included in the 1930 London Naval Treaty, an agreement intended to prevent a costly naval arms race. Faced with tonnage restrictions on its navy and unexpectedly high cost of maintaining the 2 vessels during a crippling depression, on April 10, 1931, the 2 submarines were returned to the service of the Royal Navy. The Submarine Association of Australia writes it would be 36 years before Australia would own another submarine. The Oxley first was returned to the Mediterranean, but in August 1939, the boat, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Harold Godfrey Bowerman, was attached to the 2nd Submarine Flotilla, and with 4 other submarines of the flotilla stationed off the coast of Norway, along what was called the Oberstad Line, referring to a village along the Norway coast. The submarines were patrolling that area when war was declared, September 3rd. 7 days later, Oxley was patrolling off the coast of Norway, the boat's patrol zone being west of the T-class submarine HMS Triton, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Hugh Patrick de Creary Steele. Military historian Jeffrey Regan explained in 1993, the submarines were stationed 12 miles apart, and each had a sector to patrol. Oxley, Sector 4. Triton, Sector 5. Bowerman later reported that Oxley was submerged at periscope depth with a speed that varied between 2 to 3 knots on a course of 156 degrees. When around 1500 hours, they made sonar contact with Triton, with the operator saying that Triton was 7¼ miles away. Assuming that he was about 1½ miles inside the eastern limit of his patrol sector, he shifted course westward 240 degrees for 2 hours, assuming this would be enough to overcome the eastward current. A second sonar contact, however, at 1700 hours found Triton at a range of only 4,900 yards. But communication was lost, and he considered the finding to be improbable. He instead decided to rely on the previous information. He surfaced at 20-30 hours to take a bearing. He was, however, confused as to his location. The current had been, apparently, stronger than predicted, and the boat had drifted east. Regan writes, apparently Bowerman had thought himself 2 miles inside his own sector, at a time when he was, in fact, 4 miles inside Triton. Bowerman might have figured out the issue, as he said that he was able to see the loom of Oberstedt and Igro Light. That would have put him too close to the coast, too far east, but he was unable to see the actual lights due to misty rain. At 20:45 hours, he was relieved on watch by Lieutenant F.K. Manley, who reported that he warned Manley of the possibility of seeing Triton based on the earlier sonar contacts. Bowerman then went to the wardroom and checked the submarine's position and a course on a chart. But just 5 minutes later, he was informed that Manley had sighted a submarine. Bowerman proceeded to the bridge. He reported, on emerging from the upper conning tower, the OOW, officer of the watch, told me that a submarine was just abaft the starboard beam and had fired a grenade. By that he meant 3 green rifle grenade flares. Able Seaman Herbert Gooks, who had taken over duties on deck as a lookout, recalled, I then heard Petty Officer Mingay say, "Shall I make a challenge?" A second afterwards, I heard the report of the rifle, and at the same time I got to the platform to take over the port lookout and didn't see any light from the grenade or any other lights. That is to say, Manley had apparently ordered a flare be sent up from Oxley, but the flare apparently misfired. This was confirmed by Bowerman, who said that upon returning to the bridge, Manley told me that we had fired a grenade in answer, but that it had failed to function. The submarine that they had sighted and had fired the flare was HMS Triton. Steele reported that Triton had surfaced at 19:55 hours, fixed a position off the Oberstedt Light, set a slow zigzag patrol, and began charging the batteries. Like Bowerman, Steele handed the bridge over to an officer of the watch and went below, with orders that he was to be called if anything unusual appeared. At 20:45, Steele was called to the bridge as an object in the water could be seen very fine on the port bow. He reported, I took the ship and kept Triton bows on. From what I could see, it appeared to be on a broad track, I should say about 120 degrees, and the object was steering in a northwesterly direction. It occurred to me that it might be Oxley, and I dismissed the thought almost as soon as it crossed my mind, because earlier in the day I had been in communication with Oxley and had given her my position accurately, which was 2 miles south of my billet, number 5, and Oxley had acknowledged this, and had also given them my course, which said at the time 154 degrees. He called for a signalman, but wary, he also had the main engine started and torpedo tubes 7 and 8 prepared to be fired. It was at this time, he reported, that the object was recognized as a submarine, low in the water. He had the signalman send a signal with a box lamp, sending Morse code via a system of flashing lights. Steele reported, the signalman on the bridge was ordered to make a challenge with the box lamp, which he made slowly. After 20 seconds, when there was no reply, he was ordered to make a second challenge. Again, no reply. After a short interval, a third challenge was made, with still no reply. It is unclear what was seen aboard Oxley, but Bowerman reported asking Manley if he had made the private signal reply. It was reported that Manley was a qualified pilot who had served with the Merchant Marine and was fully capable of reading and making Morse code. But while Bowerman said that Manley said that he had replied, he must have been hesitant or doubtful, because I remember telling him to make it again, to be certain. He had just commenced making it, and I had by this time got out of the conning tower and was looking to starboard, although my eyes were not by that time accustomed to the light, when I saw a flash immediately beneath me, and heard a dull explosion, and the boat shook. While they were signaling, Steele had been trying to make out the shape of the submarine he was seeing. He reported that during this time I had been studying the submarine very closely indeed. She was trimmed down very low, and I could see nothing of her bow or shape, and the conning tower didn't look like Oxley's, and I could not see any outstanding points of identification, such as periscope standards, etc. By this time, I was completely convinced that this was an enemy submarine. I counted 15 to myself, like this, and 1, and 2, and 3, and when I had counted 15 to myself, gave the order to fire. Number 7 and number 8 tubes were fired at 3-second intervals. About half a minute after firing, indeterminate flashing was seen from the submarine. This was unreadable and stopped in a few seconds. The officer of the watch also saw this. It gave me the impression that somebody was looking for something with a torch. It was certainly not Morse code. Very shortly afterwards, a matter of a few seconds after the flashing had stopped, one of my torpedoes hit. Bowerman reported that Oxley seemed to list to port and break in two from the center. As Regan says, Triton had shot to kill. Bowerman was catapulted into the water by the explosion, as were Lieutenant Manley and able seaman Gooks. Steele moved Triton to the location of the sinking and heard the 3 men shouting. 2 of Triton's officers, Lieutenants Guy Watkins and Harry Stacy, tied lines to themselves and jumped in to rescue Bowerman and Gooks. Manley was seen swimming towards them strongly when he suddenly sank from view. Manley's body, as well as those of the rest of Oxley's crew, was never recovered. The Board of Inquiry made recommendations to Rear Admiral Bertram Chalmers Watson, in command of the Royal Navy's submarine service. They found, "We do not consider Lieutenant Commander H.P.C. Steele, Royal Navy, in any way to blame. He realized the possibility of Oxley being in the vicinity and warned the officer of the watch of that possibility. When he sighted the submarine, in order to make quite sure of her identity, he had the challenge made 3 times, and in addition fired a rifle grenade, and then he waited at least further 15 seconds. When all doubt being removed, he gave the order to fire." They found Lieutenant Commander Bowerman to be 10% to blame for being eastward of his patrol area, writing he was misled by his HTD giving him a range of 7¼ miles from Triton. The fact that he could see the glare of the shore lights should further have warned him of his easterly drift. Most of the blame they passed to the deceased Lieutenant Manley, who, as the officer of the watch, did not keep and kept a proper lookout. The first loss of a British, or for that matter Allied submarine of the then brief war was the casualty of fire from its own side, the result, Regan writes, of a mixture of misfortune and incompetence. Watson was more charitable, noting the irregular sets of the sonar and the correct disinclination of commanding officers to surface for sights because of the risk of being seen by enemy aircraft. He believed the board had erred in assigning blame to Bowerman, writing, "There is no evidence to show that this officer did not do all that a reasonably careful and capable officer should have done in the circumstances." Following the incident, patrol areas were increased from 12 to 16 miles to prevent further instances. It wasn't enough. 4 days later, Lieutenant George Gregory, in command of the submarine HMS Sturgeon, reported firing 3 torpedoes at a German submarine, writing in his log, "The enemy was seen to dive. Fired 3 torpedoes. The first passed over the stern of the enemy. The other 2 missed astern." It was, of course, fortunate that all 3 torpedoes missed, as the submarine he targeted was in fact not a German, but HMS Swordfish. But there was something also very interesting in the Rear Admiral's report. Watson wrote, "In reference to the finding of the Board of Inquiry, it is for consideration whether a court-martial should be convened, either to try Lieutenant Commander Bowerman on a charge under the Naval Discipline Act, or alternatively to try both survivors under the provision of Section 92 of that Act. Under the circumstances, it is recommended that no court-martial should be held because A, no evidence other than that of the commanding officer is available from Oxley, and B, unnecessary publicity would result from holding a court-martial. So far, the circumstances in which Oxley was lost have not been made public, and no useful purpose would be served." That is, the Admiralty had already decided not to tell the truth about the loss of HMS Oxley. Regan opines, "There was nothing very friendly about the telegrams which informed the families of the dead that they had been lost in action. It was just a way of shielding the bereaved from the feeling of utter waste, which went with the knowledge that one's menfolk had been killed by their own colleagues." On November 8th, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, reported to Parliament that the Oxley had been destroyed in an accidental explosion in circumstances that made publication inadvisable at the time, with the Admiralty reporting that 4 officers and 49 men were lost. The Associated Press noted that he did not disclose the place or date of the sinking. The Admiralty stuck to its story, with the July 1942 edition of the U.S. Naval Institute Press reporting, "Hostilities had scarcely begun when the 1,354-ton Oxley was destroyed in port by an accidental blast which claimed the lives of 4 officers and 49 ratings. The cause of the fatal blast has not been revealed, but it is probable that a torpedo exploded as it was being taken aboard the submarine. This grievous loss was withheld for some weeks, as Mr. Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, did not disclose it until the following November."
Lieutenant Bowerman faced no penalty. He was given command of a destroyer, eventually earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Lieutenants Watkins and Stacy were both recommended for awards for their life-saving. Reportedly, the Royal Navy lied again about the sinking of the Oxley after the war, telling the relatives of the sailors that had died that the 2 submarines had accidentally collided. It wasn't until the 1950s that the results of the Board of Inquiry were released and the true story was known. It was all kept so secret that in 1989, the London newspaper The Sunday People reported that 80-year-old war widow Maria Bromillo only found out that year, 50 years after the event, that her husband had been killed by his own navy, a secret that had been uncovered by her grandson. The motive for concealing a friendly fire incident this early in the war in order to preserve public morale might be understandable, if dishonest. But why did the Royal Navy hide this secret for so long? Well, probably the Royal Navy was not anxious to advertise a dubious distinction of HMS Oxley. The first successful sinking of an enemy vessel by the Royal Navy was HMS Sturgeon, which sank a German anti-submarine trawler on September 13th. Meaning that HMS Oxley was not just the first vessel of the Royal Navy to be sunk in the Second World War, it was also the first vessel to be sunk by the Royal Navy in the Second World War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.